We always hear about Gaza when it comes to Israel and Palestine, but today we're going to kind of dig into a place that's rarely in the headlines, the West Bank. It's a region where, well, according to this recent blog post I read on Investor, some pretty dramatic political shifts are underway there, shifts that could have massive implications for the whole region.
Yeah, it's true. The West Bank is often overlooked, but
hmm
what's happening there right now, it's crucial for understanding the future of this conflict.
Okay, so this blog post mentions a surge in support for Hamas in the West Bank. And get this, polls now show their support has jumped from 12% to a staggering 44%. I mean, that's a seismic shift. What's driving this change?
Well, it's not necessarily about ideology. What we're seeing is a shift in perception. Palestinians are increasingly looking to Hamas because they see them as effective.
Effective. But how can you say that when Hamas is often labeled a terrorist organization?
Right. It's important to understand that for many Palestinians, effectiveness means standing up to Israel, resisting what they see as an oppressive force. And in that context, Hamas's actions, particularly since their attack on Israel on October 7th, have resonated deeply with a population that feels increasingly disillusioned with the Palestinian Authority.
So you're saying that this isn't just about agreeing with Hamas's entire agenda. It's about seeing them as a force that can actually challenge the status quo.
Exactly. The Palestinian Authority, or PA, which has been in control of the West Bank, is dominated by Fatah, Hamas's rival. And even before this recent escalation, the PA was facing a lot of criticism, seen as corrupt, ineffective, and essentially powerless against Israel.
Which makes me wonder, how has the PA been reacting to this surge in support for Hamas? It must be a pretty precarious position for them.
They're caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they're trying to maintain their authority, their legitimacy as the representative body for Palestinians. But on the other hand, they're facing mounting pressure from their own people who are looking to Hamas as a viable alternative.
It's like a pressure cooker situation. You have this growing sense of frustration and desperation among Palestinians in the West Bank, fueled by events like the October 7th attack and the subsequent Israeli response.
Absolutely. The Israeli airstrikes and ground operations in Gaza, the intensified military actions in the West Bank itself, the raids, the clashes with emerging Palestinian militias, all of this has created an environment of fear and instability.
And this is where we see the rise of groups like the Tulqam Brigade, right? This local militia made up of mostly young Palestinians. What can you tell us about them?
They're a fascinating example of this shift towards armed resistance. They're not a huge force, but they represent something very powerful. For many Palestinians, they embody this idea of fighting back, of taking a stand against what they see as an oppressive force.
It's almost like they've become folk heroes in a way. I mean, imagine what it's like to be a young Palestinian in the West Bank right now. Seeing your streets reduced to rubble by Israeli bulldozers, living with the constant threat of violence, lacking basic services like water and electricity. It's got to feel like the world has forgotten about you.
It's a daily reality of hardship and insecurity. And in that environment, the idea of resistance, of fighting back, becomes incredibly appealing.
So it's not just about politics anymore. It's about survival. It's about feeling like you have some agency in a situation where you feel powerless.
Exactly. And this is where Hamas's narrative of resistance really gains traction. The resilience in Gaza, their ability to withstand Israeli bombardment, it feeds into this perception that they're the ones who are willing to stand up and fight.
And it's not just the events in Gaza that are contributing to this sense of desperation. We can't ignore the impact of settler violence. On the ground in the West Bank, the blog post mentions a particularly horrifying incident in the village of Qasra on October 11th, where a group of masked settlers killed 4 Palestinians.
That incident, much of which was caught on video, sent shockwaves through the West Bank. It reinforced the feeling among many Palestinians that they're unprotected, that their lives are at risk.
And that the PA is unable or unwilling to protect them.
Precisely. Incidents like this further undermine the PA's already shaky legitimacy and fuel the perception that they're either complicit in Israeli actions or simply powerless to stop them.
So the PA is really stuck between a rock and a hard place here. They're trying to appease the international community, maintain some semblance of control, but at the same time, they're facing this growing wave of support for Hamas and armed resistance within their own population.
It's a complex and volatile situation, and to understand what might happen next, we need to dig deeper into the dynamics at play, both within Palestinian society and in the broader context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It feels like we're talking about a powder keg ready to explode. This blog post, Investor, really got me thinking, what happens if the PA does lose control? Does Hamas just step in and take over the West Bank?
That's the question everyone's asking, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. While Hamas is gaining support, it's not as simple as them sweeping into power.
Why not? I mean, if they're seen as the effective ones, the ones willing to fight, wouldn't people rally behind them?
Well, there's a difference between supporting resistance and embracing Hamas's whole agenda. Remember, they have a complex ideology. It's not just about fighting Israel. There are religious and social elements that not all Palestinians agree with.
Ah, so it's more nuanced than just Hamas good, PA bad.
Exactly. We can't oversimplify things. Think of it like this. You might admire someone's courage, but that doesn't mean you want them running your life, right?
That's a great analogy. So what are the possible scenarios here? If the PA weakens, does the West Bank just become a Hamas-run territory?
That's one possibility, but it's not the only one. We could see other factions within Palestinian politics rise up. There might be new leaders who emerge, or even a splintering of power, with different groups controlling different areas.
So potentially even more chaos and instability. That doesn't sound promising for peace in the region.
It's a very real concern. And this uncertainty is exactly what makes the situation in the West Bank so critical. If the PA collapses, it throws everything up in the air. It impacts Israel's security calculations. It impacts any hope for future negotiations.
It's like this one event could trigger a cascade with unpredictable consequences.
Precisely. And it's not just about politics, is it? We're talking about the lives of real people. Palestinians in the West Bank are caught in the middle of this, facing hardship, violence, and an uncertain future.
It's easy to forget that when we talk about geopolitics. We're talking about people's lives, their hopes, their fears.
That's why it's crucial to understand the human dimension of this conflict. The blog post mentioned the impact of settler violence.
Yeah.
And that's something that can't be ignored.
The attack in Qusra, where those settlers killed 4 Palestinians. It's chilling to think that this kind of violence is happening.
And it's not an isolated incident. Settler violence contributes to the climate of fear and distrust. It makes Palestinians feel even more vulnerable. And it strengthens the appeal of groups like Hamas, who promise to protect them.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? The violence fuels the anger and desperation, which in turn fuels more violence.
Unfortunately, yes. And it makes finding a path towards peace even more difficult.
So where do we go from here? What are the potential paths forward, both for the Palestinians and for the region as a whole?
Yeah, it's clear from this deep dive that the situation in the West Bank is incredibly complex. We've got this surge in support for Hamas, a Palestinian Authority facing a crisis of legitimacy, and a backdrop of ongoing violence and uncertainty. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And this Investor blog post has done a great job of highlighting some of the key factors driving this shift in Palestinian politics. But it also raises some really big questions about the future.
Yeah, like what is the future of the West Bank? Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution to this conflict? Or are we just headed towards more violence and instability? Well, I think it's important to remember that even in the most challenging situations, there's always a possibility for change. But achieving peace requires understanding the root causes of the conflict and addressing them in a meaningful way.
So what are some of those root causes? We've talked about the perception of the PA as ineffective.
Yeah.
And the impact of settler violence. But is there more to it than that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can't talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without acknowledging the historical context. Decades of occupation, the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the restrictions on Palestinian movement and freedom, these are all factors that have contributed to the current situation.
And it creates this feeling of hopelessness, doesn't it? Like no matter what you do, nothing will ever change.
Exactly. And that sense of hopelessness can be incredibly dangerous, can lead people to feel like they have nothing to lose, which makes them more susceptible to extremist ideologies and more willing to resort to violence.
So what needs to happen to break this cycle? What are the potential paths towards a more peaceful future?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are no easy answers. But I think it starts with dialogue, with both sides being willing to come to the table and negotiate in good faith.
What if that dialogue fails? What if neither side is willing to compromise?
That's a real possibility, unfortunately. And in that case, I think we need to look beyond the traditional two-state solution framework.
You mean consider alternatives, like a one-state solution,
Yeah.
where Israelis and Palestinians share equal rights and citizenship?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Or perhaps some other kind of federal arrangement. The point is that we need to be open to creative solutions, solutions that address the core grievances of both sides.
Because sticking with the status quo just isn't working.
Exactly. The current situation is unsustainable. It's leading to more violence, more instability,
Yeah.
and more suffering for everyone involved.
So for our listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive into the shifting sands of the West Bank, I think the key takeaway is that this is a situation that demands our attention. It's not just a faraway conflict, it's a human tragedy that has implications for all of us.
I agree, and the more we understand the complexities, the nuances of this conflict, the better equipped we are to engage in meaningful conversations and contribute to a more peaceful future.
So keep learning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep hope alive.